You are standing in a garage in Flagstaff, Arizona, next to a water tank that stays at 140 degrees Fahrenheit from October through April, using nothing but a coil of black copper pipe mounted on the south side of the house. No grid connection, no solar panels, no electricity of any kind involved in the heating process. The pipe cost $80. The tank was salvaged for $30. The whole system has supplied hot water to a household of 5 for 7 years without a single repair. A rooftop PV solar installation of equivalent output costs the neighbor $20,000 and degrades by roughly 0.5% every year until it needs replacement. By the end of this, you will know exactly why your solar panels waste 70% of available sunlight. Why the industry that sells them needed you to never find out, and how a $150 fix changes that permanently. 6 years ago, I spent $14,000 on a rooftop solar array. 12 panels, a grid-tied inverter, the full installation. The salesman told me my electricity bill would drop by 80%. The first bill after the system went live was $212. The second was $194. The third was $206. Nobody I called could explain the gap in plain language. A friend of mine named Frank Halverson, a retired mechanical engineer out of Flagstaff, Arizona, had been watching this happen across his neighborhood for years. He said the solar industry had been selling people half a solution for 4 decades, and the other half was sitting in plain sight at every hardware store in the country. For $150 in copper pipe and basic fittings, he said, I could capture more usable energy from the sun in a single afternoon than my $14,000 array produced in a week. I thought he was wrong. I drove to Flagstaff anyway. Frank walked me around the south side of his house to a frame mounted against the garden wall. Black copper pipe coiled inside a simple wooden box with polycarbonate over the front. A garden hose running in at the bottom, a second hose running out at the top. He pressed my hand against the outflow pipe. It was almost too hot to hold. His materials receipt was still taped to the inside of the frame. $143, dated 9 years earlier. What I saw against that wall changed how I think about solar energy. A photovoltaic solar panel converts roughly 15 to 22% of the sunlight that hits it into electricity. The rest, 78 to 85%, becomes heat and is lost. That is not a malfunction. That is how the technology works at a fundamental physical level. Silicon cells capture a narrow band of the solar spectrum, and everything outside that band passes through as thermal energy the panel cannot use. Solar thermal works on a different principle entirely. A dark absorber surface, copper pipe painted black, absorbs solar radiation and transfers that heat directly to water flowing through it. No conversion, no semiconductor, no inverter. The efficiency of a well-built solar thermal collector runs between 60 and 80% of available solar energy captured as usable heat. That is the gap, 15 to 22% versus 60 to 80%. 3 to 4 times more usable energy from the same square foot of sunlight, at a fraction of the cost. A 2001 study by the Florida Solar Energy Center measured delivered energy costs of residential solar thermal systems against grid-tied PV systems powering electric water heaters. Solar thermal delivered usable hot water energy at roughly 1/5 the cost per unit. The researchers were not comparing experimental prototypes. They were measuring monitored residential installations that had been running for years across Florida, Arizona, and New Mexico, ordinary houses, ordinary households, ordinary south-facing roofs. The study recommended that residential solar programs prioritize thermal systems for water heating before any PV installation. That recommendation did not make it into a single federal incentive program written after 2003. Simple. Physical. Old as the aqueduct. And that is where this story turns. In 1979, a report was filed with the Department of Energy under the Carter administration. It was produced by the Solar Energy Research Institute in Golden, Colorado, the federal laboratory established specifically to evaluate residential solar technologies. The conclusion was direct. Solar thermal systems for residential hot water were more cost-effective, more energy efficient, and longer lasting than any grid-tied photovoltaic alternative by a margin. The report described as not close. Federal incentives for thermal systems were recommended as the first and most accessible step toward residential energy independence. That recommendation did not survive the decade. According to the National Archives records of the subsequent federal solar program proceedings, the incentive structure that emerged was shaped by testimony from photovoltaic manufacturers, electric utility associations, and semiconductor industry representatives. Solar thermal was included in early residential tax credit language, then progressively narrowed, then allowed to expire in 1985 without renewal, while PV incentives were extended and eventually made permanent under the investment tax credit in 2006. Chemical storage was the future. Solar thermal was too complex. Federal dollars belonged in semiconductor research. Within 7 years, the Solar Energy Research Institute report was buried under a funding restructure that redirected its mandate toward photovoltaic development. The original report still exists in the federal document repository. I have held a printed copy. It is 38 pages long and the margins are clean. No annotations, no citations from subsequent federal programs, no evidence that anyone in a position to act on it ever read past the executive summary. Somebody benefited from you spending $14,000 on a system that captures 20% of available solar energy instead of $150 on a system that captures 4 times as much. Someone has been benefiting for 45 years. The complexity argument was not honest. A solar thermal system has 3 components: a dark absorber surface, a pipe carrying water, a storage tank. No inverter, no charge controller, no battery management system, no grid interconnection agreement. The most complicated part of the installation is connecting a garden hose fitting. Frank Halverson's setup cost $143 9 years ago. 30 feet of 3/4-inch black copper pipe, a salvaged 40-gallon hot water tank from a neighbor's renovation, basic fittings, and a wooden frame built from scrap lumber in 2 hours. He painted the copper and the backing with flat black spray paint from a can that cost $4. His total build time was 1 afternoon. That system covers approximately 70% of his household's annual hot water demand for a family of 4. His electric water heating bill dropped from $68 per month to $19 within the first year. Over 9 years, that represents savings of just under $5,000 against a $143 investment. Zero maintenance beyond checking the fittings once a year and adding antifreeze before the first hard frost. The average American household spends between $400 and $600 per year on water heating, according to the United States Energy Information Administration. Frank Halverson now spends roughly $220. The gap closes completely with a second collector panel costing another $120 in materials. Now, if you already own a home and are thinking this only applies to people building from scratch, stay with me. You do not need a new roof. You do not need a solar contractor. You do not need a permit in most states for a passive closed-loop system that does not connect to the grid or modify your plumbing beyond a garden hose fitting. Any south-facing surface works. A roof pitch, a garden wall, a shed exterior, a ground-mounted frame in the yard. The collector does not care what it is attached to as long as it faces south and tilts at roughly your local latitude in degrees. A protractor and a piece of scrap wood handle the geometry in 4 minutes. The materials list is almost embarrassing. Black copper pipe or black polyethylene irrigation tubing, 30 to 40 feet of 3/4-inch diameter, runs between $20 and $40 at any hardware store. A salvaged electric water heater tank, which any plumber or demolition crew will give you for free or close to it, serves as the storage vessel. Basic compression fittings and garden hose adapters, another $15 to $20. A sheet of polycarbonate for the glazing, salvageable from any greenhouse supplier for $10 to $30. Flat black spray paint, $4. Scrap lumber for the frame, free if you ask at any construction site. Total out-of-pocket, sourced carefully, runs between $100 and $170. That is 90% cheaper than a commercially installed solar thermal panel system. And it will outlive you. But here's the part that stunned me most. And this is what I want you to hold on to. In 1955, the New Mexico Engineering Experiment Station published a 41-page technical bulletin titled Selective Surface Coatings for Solar Thermal Collectors, written by an engineer named Harold Bliss. It was never distributed beyond the state technical library system. It was never cited in a federal solar energy document. Frank Halverson found a physical copy in a second-hand technical bookshop in Santa Fe in 2003. I have read the relevant pages myself. The finding fits in 2 sentences. A standard flat black paint absorbs solar radiation at roughly 95% efficiency, but re-radiates that heat back into the air at nearly the same rate once the surface reaches operating temperature. A selective absorber coating, a specific electroplated copper oxide finish, absorbs at 95% but re-radiates at less than 5%. That single modification increases usable thermal output by approximately 40% under identical sunlight conditions. Bliss demonstrated this in controlled outdoor tests in Albuquerque in 1954 and 1955, measuring water outlet temperatures across matched collector panels, one with standard black paint, one with the selective surface. The selective panel delivered 42% more usable hot water energy across all test conditions. The coating cannot be patented. The chemistry is too simple and too well documented in pre-existing metallurgical literature. There is no recurring revenue in it. A homeowner applies it once with a brush and a solution costing $11 and never thinks about it again. Bliss wrote in his introduction that a technology this effective and this simple belonged to whoever needed it most. I read that line twice. In 1992, Congress passed the Energy Policy Act. On paper, it was the most comprehensive federal energy legislation in over a decade. It included a residential energy tax credit structure that solar advocates had been lobbying for since the Carter-era credits expired in 1985. What that credit structure covered was specific, and the specificity was not accidental. Photovoltaic panels qualified. Grid-tied inverters qualified. Passive solar thermal collectors built from copper pipe and installed without a licensed contractor did not qualify. The definitional language required certified components installed by certified professionals according to standards maintained by trade associations, whose membership consisted primarily of photovoltaic manufacturers and their supply chain partners. A retired engineer named Dr. James Platts testified before the Senate Energy Committee in March of 1993 during the regulatory comment period for the implementing rules. His testimony runs 27 pages in the committee record. On page 14, he stated that the certification requirements, as written, would exclude 90% of functional solar thermal systems from qualifying, while including 100% of grid-tied PV systems, regardless of actual energy efficiency per dollar invested. The certification language was not changed. Platts continued publishing through the Southwest Solar Research Network until it dissolved in 2004. His research papers are held at the University of New Mexico Engineering Library, donated by his family in 2007, and cataloged by a graduate student named Rosa Mendez in 2011. The files fill 4 archival boxes. Frank Halverson drove to Albuquerque to read them in 2009 and came back with photocopies he keeps in a manila folder in the same cabinet where he stores his materials receipts. Her comparative analysis found solar thermal delivering usable energy at 23 cents per kilowatt hour equivalent against grid-tied PV at $1.14. Over a 30-year service life, that difference represents tens of thousands of dollars per household. I thought about the $14,000 I spent 6 years ago. I thought about every household that had been handed the same choice I was handed and told it was the only one available. And I felt something very close to anger. Frank Halverson's system in Flagstaff covers 70% of his household's annual hot water demand. His electric water heating bill runs $19 a month. His total material investment was $143 9 years ago. He has spent nothing on it since beyond 20 minutes once a year checking the fittings. That is what $150 in copper pipe produces when you build it correctly and point it south. For 30 years, American households have been told they had 2 choices for solar energy. Pay $20,000 for a rooftop PV system that captures 20% of available sunlight and requires a licensed installer, a utility interconnection agreement, and an inverter replacement every 12 years. Or stay on the grid and keep paying the electric company every month. Those were never the only choices. There was always a third option: copper pipe, black paint, a salvaged tank. Sunlight that has been falling on south-facing roofs for free since before the electric grid existed. A technology the 1979 Solar Energy Research Institute called the superior residential solar solution, and that 45 years of federal incentive policy made nearly invisible to the households that needed it most. The efficiency gap is documented. The suppression of the incentive structure is in the congressional record. The selective surface coating is in a 1955 technical bulletin in a second-hand bookshop in Santa Fe. None of it is secret. All of it has been waiting, and all of it is now yours. Tell me in the comments whether you would mount this on your roof or build a ground frame in your yard. I read every one. And if you want to keep recovering what the incentive structure made invisible, that is what this community is here for.